Order, order. Good afternoon, Secretary of State. Thank you for appearing before us this afternoon, and to Sarah Healy, the Permanent Secretary. Welcome to the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. Just firstly, Secretary of State, how would you like us to address you? Deputy Prime Minister or Secretary of State?
However you like.
And
absolutely.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions. We've got our committee here this afternoon, and we're keen to make sure that your replies are quite succinct because we've got a lot to get through. Happy New Year to you.
Thank you.
Just to start us off, Secretary of State, what are your department's priorities for this Parliament?
Well, thank you, first of all, and Happy New Year. And we have a full programme, as you've seen, from July after the general election. We've been motoring at quite full speed. And I think that reflects the challenges we face, in particular, around housing and also, in particular, around local government. There is two key areas where I feel like the pressures have been on, and I suspect quite a lot of questioning today will be around those areas. So making sure that people have a good, safe home that they can call a home rather than an asset, so that people have somewhere where they can live. We've seen the rise in temporary accommodation, and 160,000 children just this Christmas were in temporary accommodation, which the social cost of that, but also the pressures that has put on councils, I think, has been significant. So tackling the housing supply issue so that people have a good, safe home. We, just before we broke up, we had, of course, phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry, and making sure that we do everything we can to look at those recommendations. And the Prime Minister is coming back in March with the government's response to the recommendations, and local government putting them on a financial secure footing for the future, because they were in significant need going forward. And you'll have seen all the other bits of work we're doing, but to be succinct, they would be the things that I would say that have caused significant pressure, but also about how we were able to stabilise after what we inherited.
And that's really important, and it's good to outline those key areas. You'll be aware, Secretary of State, in the department's tweets in the new year outlining some of those key responsibilities and to-do list. A big omission on that to-do list was leasehold reform. So many leaseholders up and down the country, as you all know, that dream of owning their own actually turned into a nightmare. When will leaseholders see reform coming forward, or will they have to wait yet another year before anything's done on that?
Well, Chair, thank you, and you're absolutely right. Leasehold has been a significant problem, and it's a problem we inherited. There was work done on leasehold reform from the previous government, but there were big gaps within that bill which were quite complex. We brought forward, as part of His Majesty's King's Speech, a number of legislation, including on leasehold reform. We want to make sure we're moving at pace. We want to take that forward as quickly as possible, but we also want to make sure that there isn't unintended consequences, because there are a few gaps within that legislation currently that could cause problems. I think during the previous Parliament, was Shadow Housing Secretary, who is now our Housing Minister, raised a number of issues, in, for example, that it wouldn't even impact on flats. So there is importance to making sure that we're able to influence that legislation and bring common hold as the default position.
Just on that, Secretary of State, when will leaseholders actually see that legislation implemented by the House? Because I think, again, so many leaseholders didn't have a peaceful or joyful Christmas because they were worried about what charges are going to come through their doors. They were worried about the fact that some of them are still living in properties with unsafe cladding. They were worried about the insurance premiums that continue to go up every year. So just in terms of the timeline, Deputy Prime Minister, do you have that?
We want to do that within this year, bring forward the legislation. There's a number of things within that you say, like insurance, the remediation plan. We've done the remediation acceleration plan that we put forward and published. We're looking at insurance at the moment and doing a consultation exercise so that we can help people who are in those circumstances. And again, we're looking at aspects of the previous government's legislation around leasehold and how we can amend that, bring that legislation forward, but also move towards comprehensively going towards common hold as the default tenure.
What would you say are the biggest funding pressures with respect to prioritisation and local government finance?
There's a number of impacts on local government finance. I would say that children and adult services is having a significant impact on local government finance. I would say that obviously temporary accommodation is having a significant, and homelessness is having a significant impact on local government finances, and that we've been doing quite a lot of work to try and address some of those pressures. So we've put a real terms 3.5% increase for local government. We're moving towards multi-year settlement for local government, which will help them stabilise their finances, and trying to ensure that we get ahead of the problem. The problem that we seem to face, and it's the same with homelessness at the moment, is we're spending huge sums of money on inappropriate accommodation because we can't front load the problem with supply. So the work we're doing to end Section 21 no-fault evictions will hopefully stem some of the problems that we're seeing in regards to homelessness, but also the money that we announced just before Christmas to look at not just putting money in, but also about how we can reform the system to better make sure that we prevent homelessness, and that we deal not only with the supply problem that we've got in the UK, but also about how we can put measures in place to mitigate people being homeless in the first place, particularly families.
And that's good. And you touched on the number of children who woke up on Christmas Day just gone in temporary accommodation, but yet we have a situation where the government chose to freeze the local housing allowance, which in a sense helped a number of families not face homelessness in terms of evictions. The ending Section 21 is going to be a real game changer for many families, but where families are not able to keep up with the rent and there is now a freeze on the local government housing allowance, do you not feel that this will undo all the good work you're doing within your department?
I do understand the question that you're making and the issue around the local housing allowance, but what we've tried to do is take a number of measures, including the supply, including supporting families with the work that we're doing with the Employment Rights Bill, monies to families, supporting them against homelessness, ending Section 21 no-fault evictions. There's a number of measures that we're trying to take to prevent homelessness and to ensure that we can deal with the root cause of the problem, which includes why we're spending so much, and there is billions of pounds being spent on local housing allowance. Is the real elephant in the room is that we just don't have enough homes, and we haven't been building enough social homes, and that's why I've made it very clear not that we need to just build 1.5 million homes, but we have to have the biggest wave of social and affordable housing for a generation, and we're determined to deliver that.
And that has to come at the right time. But were there discussions with both with the Secretary of State for Department for Work and Pensions and the Chancellor with regards to the impact of freezing the local housing allowance, the pressures that will cause councils who are already seeing their departments being stretched, the pressures in terms of that 1 billion additional funding which your department has given councils but will be absorbed because a number of those councils are still spending a big chunk of their funding on temporary accommodation?
We have discussions around Cabinet on a whole number of measures, as I outlined the work that we're doing on child poverty, for example. We have an interministerial group on that. The work that we've been doing on homelessness, again, we have an interministerial group on that looks across departments. The issue around children's services and special educational needs and disabilities, we've been working with the departments on that. So there's a number of measures. We know that these are very difficult decisions. We've tried to put extra funding in place, as I mentioned, around homelessness and supporting councils with the uplift of money this year, because the budget that we had to set and the inheritance that we got was so dire. It was about stabilising, and now it's about how we can support the initiatives going forward where we can help families, and we can, in the long run and the medium term, is deal with the supply problem, because the issue that we've got is there's a huge sum of money. If you look at the money that's going into homelessness, if you look at the money that's going into local housing allowance, there's huge sums of money, but it's not the resource that's providing the home, a permanent home that people desperately need. And then until we build those social housing, then we're not going to be able to solve this issue. No,
and until we build the social housing, families need somewhere to live now. By freezing a local housing allowance, more families may find themselves being evicted because they cannot pay their rent. Just lastly, Deputy Prime Minister, was there an equality impact assessment carried out before that decision was taken to freeze the local housing allowance?
Well, again, there's a number of measures that were taken at the budget, not just the local housing allowance, but a number of measures, including the work that we're doing on renters' rights and other things that can have an impact on it. So it's not just as simple as looking at what's happening over here. There's a number of measures that can impact on family income, that can impact on housing, that makes that really difficult to offset. You can look at one thing in isolation, but there's a number of other measures within the budget that can help and assist. As I say, we've put a huge cash injection into local authorities, a 3.5% real terms increase, as well as money into homelessness, as well as more money into social care, and also the measures we've taken for councils to keep their full right to buy receipts and other measures that have been taken across the board as part of that budget that we hope will stabilise the situation. I acknowledge the crisis that we face in housing. I acknowledge the pressures, stabilisation, but then move to make housing supply the number one priority. And that's why we've been really quite vocal about what we said before the election around planning reforms, around making sure we build these homes. And I'm determined that we meet that target, which is a difficult target to meet, but the whole Cabinet are working with us to make sure that the whole government will achieve the 1.5 million homes target, because we know that even with that, so for example, 1.5 million homes, we know there's 1.3 million people on waiting lists. That's just council waiting lists, let alone everybody else who needs a home. So this, even with this target, it is a dent in what is a housing crisis that has developed over a significant period of time, and we're going to make progress on that.
Thank you. So there wasn't an equality impact assessment before that decision was taken?
Again, I think it's really hard to try and do an impact assessment on one element of the budget when there was a number of measures that would have offsetted or would have an impact on it as well. So it would be difficult to get a real assessment by just saying, well, we'll just pick one thing out and see how that affects without looking at how other things affect that as well.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Lee Dillon. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Hi, I'm going to cover some local authority finance questions, if that's okay. So the first one is around funding settlements, and I think we're all accept that the 1 year funding settlement for next year is welcomed by local councils. But in your manifesto, you spoke about multi-year funding settlements. You spoke in your introductory remarks about the impact and pressures on local councils. So quite simply, why not give them multi-year funding settlements from next financial year onwards? Why delay it until future financial years?
Well, we're trying to do that, Lee, and when we came in July as a new government, the immediate situation that we found ourselves was with a significant £22 billion black hole. In my department, we'd spent our reserves fully on some very important issues like Homes for Ukraine, for example, some really important programmes that the previous government had set in train, but we didn't have the funding for it. So the first thing as a new government was that we had to stabilise the funding. So there wasn't the time and there was the urgency to look at the situation. In local government in particular, the financial situation for local councils was quite dire. We know that we'd already had a number of Section 114 notices which in effect them declaring bankruptcy, and this isn't a party political matter. This has happened for many different local authorities. So therefore, stabilising the funding for local government this year was important. But equally, as I said to the chair previously, we recognise that there's huge record sums of money going into local government and into different various priorities, but it's not necessarily producing better outcomes. So you could say that in special educational needs and disabilities, for example, there's huge funding going in, but is that giving the right outcome for those young people? It isn't. So what we're trying to do, and with the multi-year settlements, is so that councils and local authorities can plan ahead. So this year onwards and running up to the next spending review is about us how we can take forward the reform agenda as well as how we can do things differently, because we can't just keep throwing good money at bad. We also have to look at, well, is it working? Are we paying huge sums of money for example, out-of-borough placements for young people that's costing us loads of money, whereas actually what we really need to do is build a foundational amount of resources here where we know it's needed and look at better outcomes for people. So the multi-year settlement will be as soon as possible. We're looking to move towards towards that. I think the direct answer is we just didn't have the time available between setting the budget and us being able to put that in place.
So in that interim period, would you allow councils more flexibility on how they manage their funds at the moment? So, for example, capitalisation can be allocated to transition activities, but can't go directly to revenue or to go back into the general reserves, to give them the ability to manage, in effect, bridging that gap until they get the multi-year funding settlements.
What I've said to local authorities is that I want to work with them. I don't want to use the threat of 114 or anything like that. It doesn't, regardless of what council it is, I want to work with them to try and help. So what we've tried to do is, again, the first thing I said I wanted to stop is all these little pots of money like Dragon's Den approach. Well, you can bid for this and you can have a little bit over here, is to try and pool it so that local authorities, I believe local councils know what the local need is. I believe that they want to provide good services for their local area. So trying to get them to be able to utilise that and to use every mechanism they can to deliver those services locally. We are definitely looking at how we can support councils. I want to see all councils to see this government as working with them. I come from a local government background, a significant number of years in local government. I know the work that they do. They do a huge amount of work, loads of different things, and it has changed significantly over the last 30 years, and they're trying desperately with less to deliver more when demand is going up. So we are working with local authorities to help them and to work with them to deliver those services that they want to deliver.
So would it be fair to say that if there are council leaders and finance portfolio holders out here, if they've got some ways to be able to bridge that gap, is to come and speak to the department on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, I mean, I've made it really clear from the moment I went into my department is we should have a can-do attitude to support them. What local government is facing is significant. Since 2010, the money that is available to local governments has gone down, but demand has gone up. At the same time, they're being asked to do so many different things. Most people wouldn't even know that local government do it. A lot of the complaints or a lot of the issues that are raised with me as a local MP is actually a local authority issue. So local councillors and local authorities do a tremendous job and touch our lives in ways that most people would never recognise. So I understand that the pressures that are on local authorities, and my department should do everything it can to support and to try and enable them to provide those services.
And yeah, I mean, I know my own council of West Berkshire delivers over 700 services to its residents, and a vast array of services, and I know other councils will be similar. If I can just move us on to national insurance contributions, so indirectly. So the government's definition of a public and sector employer doesn't seem to extend to wider public service delivery bodies such as social care providers. And according to the King's Fund, the adult social care sector employs just as many people as the NHS. So has the government, or can the government provide clarity on any mechanisms for compensating these providers for the additional tax costs that they're going to face? And how will you help councils out if there isn't a mechanism in place?
Yeah, I mean, the government announced an additional £515 million of support for local government, including the mayoral combined authorities, fire rescue authorities, specifically to manage the impact of the changes to the employer national insurance contributions that were announced at the budget. And I know this is a pressure, and again, I come from an adult social care background, so I completely understand the pressures on care services in particular, and the fragmentation of care services and care providers and how they operate. We are working, like I say, we gave councils the real terms increase in their core spending power as well to try and support that. But we also, you'll have seen in the employment bill that we're putting forward around a fair pay agreement. I'm not quite sure that's the right name for it, by the way, because it goes way beyond pay. Actually, what we need is a care structure that has career progression, that understands the complexities of delivering care in the community, but also the opportunities to give people the best quality care in the right place at the right time, which will unlock savings if we're able to deliver that. So the FPA for me will be a game changer in terms of recognising the vital role of care workers, but also unlocking where the money needs to be spent across the NHS and care services, including within the care providers across the board, not just those that are considered the public sector, to deliver better outcomes for people. And I think not only will that deliver better outcomes, and I believe it's what I became an MP for, so I can wax lyrical about it. Not only do I believe that this will deliver better outcomes for people, but I know it will save money for the taxpayers as well. So hopefully taking that work forward over the next 12 months we'll be able to deliver for those care providers as well, because what we've also seen over the last 10 years or so is many care providers leaving because they say they can't afford it, and that's created a bottleneck again because people can't get the care in the community and therefore end up in hospital. So I think this is a real game changer, working with employers in the sector, the NHS, local authorities and others, and the trade unions that represent the workers. I think we could do something really special in this area that will deliver for people and will be able to offset some of these challenges we face, notwithstanding just the NICs, but other issues that we see in this sector.
And then just one final question from me, Chair, just still on NICs and adult social care. When the NICs rise was considered, a bit like the impact assessment on LHA, was there any impact assessment done on adult social care in particular and the pressures that the NICs rise would put on that service, given how important it is for the whole NHS model to have a functioning social care market?
I think the way I would answer this is that we know that there were pressures, not least just the NICs pressures we knew, but also the changes within the national minimum wage, for example, through the Low Pay Commission and the work that we did there. We know that there's pressures, and therefore that's why the extra funding, both that the Chancellor announced through the budget, the £550 million extra funding, but also the uplift that we gave to local authorities and the work we're trying to do to give local authorities more unring-fenced money so that they can then plug the gaps that they see in their system at the moment, and then also not just that, but give local authority the opportunity to look at reform as well, because they want to deliver good services. They just haven't got the opportunity at the moment to really drive some of that innovation.
I think it's probably worth just mentioning the £880 million increase in the social care grant specifically as part of those uplift in local government funding.
Yeah, but there are additional uplift costs in providing adult social care without the NICs rise anyway.
Yes,
well, so.
Nonetheless, a significant increase in funding.
Yeah, just overall pressure is still up.
Thank you. Sarah.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I'm going to talk now a bit about the SEND issue, which is certainly one of the biggest issues that comes up on the doorstep and in my inbox in Hyndburn. Starting off with, what are the government's plans for the broader reform of SEND and adult social care funding, given that the sort of current levels seem unsustainable in what's being spent by local authorities to provide these services when the demand just keeps going up?
Yeah, there's been, I know this has been discussed before as well with the liaison committee with the Prime Minister and the Minister for Education. There's been a significant amount of money that is going into special educational needs and disability, including the money that we've announced in local government. But I really think that there is a real challenge around reform to make sure that, for example, the out-of-borough placements we're seeing, the inadequate places for children with special educational needs, the ability really to provide that care for people in the school setting and in the wider support for their families. There is a lot of work that we're doing with the Department for Education and others to make sure that we can work with the NHS as well to deliver a better service and to talking to parents. And I think anyone who's watched Prime Minister's questions over the last couple of months across the whole House, so again it's not a party political issue I'm making, across the whole House this has been recognised by members of Parliament, so we're hoping we can work together to really try and address the problems, because whilst we're putting more funding in and there's record levels of funding going in, I don't think we're getting the best value for the young people who desperately need their needs to be met, and we're not meeting their needs early enough, and they're being let down by the system at the moment. So there's a real drive across the government departments to deliver that change as well.
And how do you envisage solutions being found that will not just improve where we are now, but I think there are families out there who are really worried that there may be winners and losers out of these reforms? And so what are you doing, and how's the approach hoping, I guess, I'm assuming, to avoid that and to avoid there being losers in the things that come forward.
Yeah, well, I mean, hopefully there isn't losers. We've put an additional £1 billion of funding into special educational needs and disabilities, and looking at the alternative provision funding as well. And I think it's fair to recognise that one size doesn't fit all, and that's the frustration that young people, even with a label of a particular disability, might present in very different ways. Neurodiverse young people have different challenges. So how we can make our education system, our health system, and all of how that impacts on young people will have a real impact on their quality of life and their outcomes for them. So I think the most important thing for us is making sure that young people get the support they need very early on in the system, and that we're able to break down some of those barriers. So, for example, young people trying to get access to CAMS now, the waiting list is so severe. Speech and language therapy services, they're really difficult to access. If you want to get an assessment for your child, I mean, it's like getting the Holy Grail, getting an EHCP plan now, and even when you get one, does anyone recognise it? So it's so frustrating for families who are at this crisis point because they're not able to get the resources they need. So we've been concentrating on having the resources available and the early intervention so that we can support families, so it doesn't have to feel like you have to fight the system, and you shouldn't have to fight the system to get a diagnosis, and you shouldn't have to fight the system to get some support. And that's what we want to turn around. And I think part of that is around looking at different types of provision that's available, but how joined up those services are as well with health, education, housing, local government, and so that people don't have to navigate a myriad of various different places where they go and find a door, one door slams and they have to go and knock on another one, and it's incredibly frustrating for families in those circumstances, and it costs us huge sums of money, and we don't have good outcomes for those young people.
I think it's really important that removing that sort of adversarial approach within the system is something you hear again and again, but how you also ensure that often what happens currently is that those with the loudest voices are often those with the most time and capability to fight within the system, and the children that might need the help even more are constantly left behind because their parents don't have that same capability. So how within the reforms you're going to tackle that particular issue so that we can be confident the children that need it the most are the priority and not just the ones that can afford to shout the loudest?
Absolutely, and that's why it's important that people and families get access to that support as well from professionals. So whether it's through a GP appointment, which can be really difficult to navigate to get, or whether that's through the school being able to alert and say, we need some support here, can we get some additional support to support a young person, or whether that's even through getting an NHS appointment, just trying the machinery of government and how we're linking in around these challenges will hopefully break down some of those silos and those barriers at the moment, because it feels like you have to go through this hoop to get here, and you've waited so long to get there, and then you might not get to that hoop. What we want to do is empower people who are in those young people's lives to look at the whole place around that child. So if it's a housing need, then let's try and fix that housing need and not say, well, we can't do anything about that, or housing can have a severe impact on special educational needs and disabilities. So you've got to be able to fix the system to have a whole systems approach to it. And that's the work that I know Bridget and Liz, both with the Child Poverty Task Force, they've been doing a huge amount of work, not just on poverty, but on how we can provide the best outcomes for children as part of our Opportunities mission.
Thank you. Just wanted to ask, obviously it's a more Department for Education one, and we've seen the VAT increase on private schools start on the 1st of January. Are you worried that any additional funding in SEND and money to local authorities will just be absorbed because there could be an additional increase of families who may not be able to afford to continue to send their children to specialist schools coming back into the state system, which obviously is something that the government would want to welcome and in terms of improving the state system for all families?
Well, we recognised also that independent schools play a vital role in providing support for some children with special educational needs and disabilities, so there were exemptions within that. So, for example, if an independent school has over 50% of children with a statement of educational needs, they're exempt from paying that VAT. So there were a number of measures that were put in within that legislation to protect those children that are in independent schools because of they have a special educational need and disability, because we recognised that that provision was unique and important for those young people.
I'm going to move on to housing and planning. Chris.
Super. Thank you, Chair. It's clearly fantastic to see the ambition on housing and planning and what's been achieved already by this government. Do you want to set us out just quickly how you see us moving towards 1.5 million, given last financial year it was 221,000 homes that were completed? We clearly need to significantly improve on that. What do you see as the journey from where we are to where we need to be?
Thanks, Chris, and really welcome the question, because often people will break it down annually. I don't see us getting there annually. There is a number of measures that we've taken immediately, like the National Planning Policy Framework and the consultation we've done already on that, which sets new mandatory targets for all local authorities. The investment in 300 new planning officers within local authorities to speed up this planning situation. We envisage an infrastructure bill probably around March time this year coming forward, so that we can take further measures, so that we can do planning reform. We introduced in the budget £500 million additional affordable homes programme. We delivered some flexibilities within that as well, so that we could get the money out the door. We've been speaking to Metro mayors and to local authorities around Homes England and how we can support that programme. We've had a new homes accelerator, so where there's been stalled sites, we've had dedicated team that have been working to unlock some of the challenges that we've faced on that. So there is a number of levers that we're pulling at the moment, which will hopefully start to turn the tide. But it's a bit like the Titanic. It's not like one of the Hackney cabs that can turn really quickly. It will take more time in the early stages before we start to see the shoots.
Just on that point, I mean, obviously, the broad point is you'll be underachieving 300,000 in the early years of the Parliament to overachieve it later in the Parliament and hopefully in subsequent Parliaments as well. One issue, though, would be that the housing targets that you're setting local councils are 370,000. The reason it's 370,000 as opposed to 300,000 is because you expect a bit of leakage there. But even still, how do you expect to be able to exceed 300,000 a year towards the latter stage of the Parliament if the housing targets that you're setting local authorities are based on an assumption of building 300,000 a year?
Well, again, we're already unlocking sites that were having challenges, and you're absolutely right. I do see us ramping it up as we get through the course of this Parliament. But with the new mandatory targets, which are over the 1.5 million homes targets, and we've also got the New Towns programme, which the task force will report later this year around new towns and the opportunities for that as well, which is not within that 1.5 target currently. We're hopeful that we'll be able to do that, and I think as sites come forward, we've got the brownfield passport, which again we're saying we want brownfield to be delivered first. I think that we'll be able to prevent some of the blockages. It can take around 7 years at the moment to get planning permission for housing. 7 years is just way too long. We need to have a system that, if you have the rules in place that protects nature, that makes sure that the houses are built safely and in the right place, and that there's been local consultation through the local plan, I think we can speed up that process.
I'll come on to the other blockages in a minute, but I mean, if it looks like we need to be increasing the annual number towards the end of this Parliament, will you look again at that 370,000 number and potentially look at increasing it? Because it may not be high enough in order to hit the kind of numbers that we need to be hitting.
Well, I've set that target, and most people, to be honest, Chris, say this is ridiculous. We can't make that target.
Not me. Make it higher.
But if somebody wants to come forward and beat that target, then we're not going to turn around and say, no, you can't do that. We want to... Look, I said at the beginning to the Chair that even with the 1.5 million homes target, which is a stretch target, and the whole of Cabinet are determined, I don't lose, I hate losing. I've always been underestimated all my life, and I'm determined personally not to lose this fight either. But even if I achieve and this government achieves the 1.5 million homes target, it is a dent. It is a dent in what we need to achieve as a whole country to deliver the houses we desperately need. We haven't seen this level of house building since the 1950s, the post-war, and it is the similar challenge that we face today to get that as well. So I think that they are achievable targets that we've set. They are mandatory, and therefore councils, local authorities will be expected to deliver on them. And I think that we may be able to get more than that in some areas, but we're working with local authorities and mayors to deliver that.
I'll come back to that point specifically in a second, but just briefly, you touched on the extra planning officers and 300 extra that we're putting in. When I speak to local authority leaders across the country, they say, not blaming anyone specifically, but given the challenges of local government finances again this year, they're not sure that they're going to be able to sustain their planning departments as it is. And I think most people would accept that even if we were successful in getting 300 planning officers, that's not enough given how much of a bottleneck is on the system. So are there any other things that you'll be looking at in order to increase the number of extra planning officers above and beyond that 300 that has already been promised and pledged?
Well, again, we've said the 300 planning officers, but we've also talked about streamlining some of the planning decisions as well. So sometimes things just get called in and are constantly in this merry-go-round, whereas actually if it's very clear what the rules are, then we should be able to move forward on some things instead of them being called in and constantly being in this merry-go-round. So hopefully by streamlining the planning system, which is what we're hoping to achieve, making it very clear what the rules are that we expect people to follow, that we'll be able to then focus the resources of planning committees and planning officers so that we don't end up with them needlessly doing more and more time on tasks that really actually they shouldn't need to do.
So, for instance, the fact that we want all local areas to have a local plan should simplify the role of planning officers, because if it's within the local plan, then it should get planning permission, and so the whole sort of process should be more streamlined, which is why kind of we think it's possible to do it within the capacity, but obviously keep it under review as we sort of go through meeting the 300 planning officers commitment.
Super. So, final question. I mean, look, if you speak to most people across the country and you ask what the biggest objection to new housing is, it's that the new housing, one of the biggest objections is that new housing isn't going to come with the infrastructure that's required. Now, look, if the system's working right, if you've got a good local plan in place, as everywhere should, you can get a lot of the infrastructure put in place with new housing developments, the schools, the GP structures. If you've got good planning officers, good council teams, good local plan, it's entirely possible to achieve that. I think one of the worries I have, and this might be particularly relevant given the area I represent, is if you're one of those places that's not just building the homes that's required for your local area, but also dramatically expanding, dramatically growing. Milton Keynes has built 3,000, but there's lots of other places across the country that are growing in population. Sure, your new housing estates can build the GP surgeries, the schools, but there's much bigger infrastructure projects. A hospital is often the key example, but there's other things as well, which can't be funded by that as well. It needs to be funded by central government. Now, in those places that are growing quite quickly, are you having conversations across government departments to ensure that those extra bits of infrastructure, like hospitals, for example, are going to come alongside that extra expansion?
Well, let me first of all acknowledge that, and I think, I've always been frustrated by the NIMBY-YIMBY sort of argument. I don't get that, because I think nearly everyone in this country knows a family member who's got a housing need that isn't being met, a daughter or a son who can't get on the housing ladder, or somebody in temporary. Everybody knows somebody, or an elderly relative that wants to downsize but can't. So everybody understands the need for buying the houses. I think for building the houses, I think we've won the argument. I think the rightful challenge and what's happened in the past is houses have been built, but the infrastructure, whether that's through 106, not being able, not getting the infrastructure that was promised from developers, or whether that's, as you say, government not providing the infrastructure that's needed. So the short answer is yes, I'm having those conversations, because actually the buy-in that we need from the electorate when we build these homes is that they have to see that that infrastructure is going alongside it, and there is cross-government work on this to make sure that where we do have those housing, that we've put extra resources in to ensure that the 106 notices, that we hold developers to account, we get the best from those 106 notices as part of that planning deal, but also that as a government we're also looking at GPs, hospitals, dentistry, and we know there are already pressures on those areas, but making sure that the schools and other facilities are built as part of that, and the transport and connectivity is with that as well. So the short answer is yes, but I also want to acknowledge the premise of the question, because I think it's a really important one that you raise, and that's where often there is a genuine frustration from people and members of the public who say, hang on a minute, I'm not in my backyard. I've got genuine concerns there, and this is what's happened, and that's why we've got to make sure that that infrastructure is critical, as well as the target of 1.5 million homes.
Thanks. Yeah, and just want to come in on build-out rates really, and just look, I absolutely support your ambition for 1.5 million new homes, and I want to see us build more, and I wish you all the success in achieving it. I don't see any evidence that suggests that we will hit that target by the end of this Parliament. I mean, I've got a strategic site, we've got an emerging local plan. The planning inspector has accepted that the build-out rate, there will be no completions until 2030-31, and that will be 60 a year. Because of that, the inspector has now required smaller sites to go into the local plan, because they can be built out quicker, but won't have the infrastructure gain that a strategic site has. And so that's just one example, and will be replicated across the country. And so if you're going to be lower on your housing completions at the beginning of the Parliament, to get to that 1.5 million, you'll have to build more at the end of the Parliament, and then you'll need the workforce to be able to build that as well. And I just haven't seen a clear enough explanation, to be honest with you, from the government on how we will get to that 1.5 million, apart from it being an aspirational target.
I think, like I say, there's a number of things we've done, like the New Homes Accelerator to unblock sites. There's been issues around nutrient neutrality and nature offsetting, which again, we're coming forward with the planning and infrastructure bill later, in the spring, to make sure that we can address some of those issues as well. We have announced additional funding for construction hubs to make sure that we've got young people that need employment, and I believe that we can match that within the construction sector, and working with the Department for Education to deliver that, and also the Employment Department as well. We've been working with Liz on how we can deliver that as well through the job centres and the DWP. So there is things that I think we are doing that will deliver that. There is simplifying the planning rules, which most of the developers say to me is that we're stuck in this merry-go-round. As I say, it can take 7, 8, you pick a number, and therefore we don't get those sites unlocked. So I think the work that we're doing now, we've also, the frustration also has been that has been put back to us is around housing associations don't have the money, and the stuff we're doing on remediation around how can they release capital to come in on a 106 for these developments. We've again been looking at that to support housing associations and councils. We've given them the opportunity to keep their right to buy receipts, which will help them to deliver. And
I support all of what you're saying on that, but that's all still got to have time to go through the process. Then you've still got to get planning application secured and then build the sites out. Then you've got 4.5 years.
I know, but we are literally simplifying that whole process and putting more investment in. So that I acknowledge your point, and if we look at where we are today and what we inherited, but I'm also equally saying we've put rocket boosters up to make sure that we get there.
I'm going to bring Lewis, and then Chris is going to finish off this section. Lewis, correct.
Thank you, and I draw everyone's attention to my register of interest as a local councillor. Just on the 7 years, you seem to be saying local councils are not doing enough to build. What about developers? Because sometimes developers don't play ball. They don't show councils that they're willing to listen, that they're willing to do 106 agreements, that they're willing to do good development, good design, for example. So sometimes they've got themselves to blame as to why they don't get planning permission or it takes 7 years. And you sort of allude to in lots of your answers that it's all councils' fault. What are we doing hearing about developers and getting them on board to do more?
Well, Lewis, first of all, I'm not saying that councils are the problem. Planning can get stuck and bogged down, and that's the acknowledgement, and I think that's just a fact. If you look at what's happening, that's what happens, and that's why clarity to the system is important, but also making sure that you hold developers to account. I think I alluded to that with the 106 notices, and making sure that we've got a dedicated team within my department that will work with local authorities to hold developers to account on that as well. And we're also supporting small developers as well. So we have huge developers that are in the business at the moment, and we want to encourage other small and medium developers to come into the field and support them to make sure that they can also develop in areas as well. So there's a number of measures we're taking to try and there's a carrot and a stick approach to this, Lewis. There's the carrot that says, look, we're going to streamline planning, we're going to make it clear so it's not subjective, so that you're not bouncing around. But equally, I expect you to hold your feet to the fire on that you're delivering on your 106 notices, you're building the houses that people need and not what you think you can get the biggest profit for, and that we'll work with those developers to deliver that, but they have to follow the rules, but we will set the rules and we'll make them very clear.
Right, thank you. Chris, finish off your section, please.
I'll just moving on to social housing, if that's okay, Chair. I might sort of link it to that question, if that's all right, because I think we talk about developers a lot, but I mean, broadly speaking, the way the model works at the moment is that developers bid for how much they can buy land for, guessing what kind of, with a local plan, having a really good reasonably good estimate of what the requirements are going to be when they build on that land, infrastructure-wise or particularly social housing-wise. That sometimes works. Sometimes then you could have a massive inflation in costs, and they try and wiggle out of those commitments. And there's a massive asymmetry on information, and housing developers are obviously trying to maximise their profit margins. They've got a duty to do so, and councils are arguing back, and it gets very messy. And often you can get in a situation where there's this trade-off that is then created, where either developers, suddenly it's not feasible for them to build the project, so we get held up, we don't hit our housing targets, we don't get our building starts, or you don't get enough social housing built, and we sort of end up in the worst of both worlds. The easiest solution, and broadly speaking throughout the whole of sort of British history where we have been really successful at house building, the answer's been do more to capture that land value and have more state intervention to ensure that you're not just driving up the land value, because it's all right talking about developers' profit margins. People that are really making the most money in the system are the landowners who are making the millions of pounds, because that land value is being driven up in certain areas. So do you think that generally, if we want to deliver the more social housing, we need to be doing more to think about how we can get those land values down in a way that doesn't hold up building starts and everything else, in a way to get more homes built? And has your department been looking at ways to achieve that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're obviously absolutely right about the value of kind of land value capture as a way of kind of funding this. There's a few things I'd sort of just say about viability specifically and the kind of role of Section 106. So we obviously consulted in the National Planning Policy Framework back at the end of July on an approach to social housing, particularly in areas of identified grey belt, to say that we wanted 50% of that to be affordable and social housing. We amended that approach specifically because of concerns over viability, and have set out that we want the local target for affordable housing plus 15% to be the content of the National Planning Policy Framework, precisely because we want to make sure we're taking account of that viability issue for developers. And what we've said is that we are going to come out with much more tight guidance about the way that viability is assessed, because as you say, we end up in these sort of debates between developers and local authorities, and in order to get the housing built, we end up agreeing for lower amounts of social and affordable housing than actually we think is kind of able to be built. And we think by tightening up that guidance, we'll be able to try and kind of constrain some of that and make sure that those arguments end up a bit more sort of balanced and only take account of viability issues when they're genuinely the case. And until we've got to the point of that tightened up guidance, then when it's the use of grey belt land under the golden rules, we're going to stick with our local target plus 15% as the proportion of affordable housing that needs to be built where land is released for use.
But I mean, outside of that, is there anything else that you think should be looked at?
Yeah, I mean, and we'll obviously be looking, particularly when we come to things new towns about how we can make absolute best use of that. We've also obviously consulted on reforming compulsory purchase orders as well in order to try and make sure that we can get hold of land where it's particularly strategically important.
Okay. Thank you. The only other thing on the social housing one is obviously your predecessor had a target of 30,000 new homes, Secretary of State. In terms of the issues that you outline in terms of homelessness, in terms of people on the waiting list, how are you going to make a dent in that if we don't have a figure and a target for how many new social homes are going to be built by this Parliament?
Yeah, I appreciate the challenge, Chair, but the reason why I haven't put a target other than we will have the biggest wave of social and council homes of a generation. The reason I haven't put a target on it is because, first of all, every government has failed to meet the target that they've set, but equally, as the Permanent Secretary just described just in that last answer, there's a number of different permutations. So depending on the local plan, which I'm not in control of because it's a local plan, they will identify the areas of land that could be used, and then depending on the area of land that could be used and the land value and other factors dependent upon how many social and council homes you can get from it. But what we will do is set out clear, like we have with the golden rules for the release of grey belt, what we think people should be delivering as part of that, so that we do get those numbers, but it very much depends on the land and the local plans on how many of them are delivered through which programme. So it would be foolish of me, without having those local plans,
even
to then
the minimum
try and,
level, Secretary of State.
Well, I think the minimum level is that I've said the biggest wave of social and council housing for a generation. So I mean that's quite a big target. I don't want to fall below where we've been in the past. I want to way exceed that. But the challenge and the reason we've put the golden rules in, and the reason that we've put so much resources into making sure that developers don't whittle out of their obligations under 106 notices, is so we can, and giving the councils their full right to buy receipts and the more additional money into affordable housing programme, is all about making sure we can deliver more social housing. But it would be ill-advised to, with all those moving parts, to try and give you an exact definitive figure, because it would be impossible. I could just go and then maybe I might reach it.
Thank you. Nishaba.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for being here today, and also for recognising some of the big challenges we face around not only with the housing crisis but homelessness more generally. Just on that, what has the interministerial group on ending homelessness achieved so far?
Well, we put a additional significant amount of funding, so there's an increase to £233 million of funding, nearly £1 billion of additional funding for homelessness and rough sleeping. What was announced at the budget, and also a £10 million emergency support package to protect rough sleepers, and we know we've had a particularly cold spell over the last couple of weeks. We've also been working with put an uplift of £192.9 million to the homelessness prevention grant to tackle causes and not just the symptoms of people being homeless. And we've been working with charities, with local authorities, with the mayors, to look at how we can also look at those vital support services around that, because often people can find themselves homeless and there's a number of different factors, not just about the practicalities of having a home. So there may be substance abuse, there may be other ongoing issues. We've also been looking at the criteria, and I wrote to local authorities in November around making sure they understand their obligations around homelessness and around making sure that people are housed within their area, and that they're given that support as well. So we've been putting additional funding in, but we've also been trying to look at we've identified 20 local authorities facing the most acute pressures for B&B as well, for temporary accommodation. So we've been looking at emergency accommodation reduction pilots as well with them, to test their innovative approaches to kickstart new initiatives of how we can prevent homelessness and how we can support people back into homes that they can feel safe and secure in. As I say, one of the one of the things that really, on a personal level, impacted on me is in my role as Secretary of State, I've visited over the Christmas period a number of the homelessness charities and spoke to those that work in the sector, and just that figure of 160,000 children being in temporary accommodation just makes me really upset, because it's not just the fact that they haven't got a home, it's also, it has an impact on all of their life chances, and therefore trying to look at innovative ways of how we can support and prevent homelessness is something that I've, not only as me as Secretary of State, but also that interministerial team have been looking at how we can deliver the services for people. So, for example, Bridget has been looking at how we can support young people that are coming out of care, so looked after children going in transition, how we can give more support, for example, in those areas. So there's a number of different things we're working on to try and support people, and particularly vulnerable people who may find themselves at risk of homelessness or homeless.
Thank you. Obviously, this is not a new issue, and I think every government has always pledged that one of their core priorities is to end homelessness. Just in terms of some of the many complexities that you've highlighted around this, a lot of work has already been done in the past on how we can end it, and there are learnings that can be taken from everybody in, but also from reports such as the Kerslake Commission, which detail how some of those complex needs, particularly around rough sleeping, can be addressed. How are you going to be using those learnings, and is there a timeline in terms of the strategy for delivering an end in terms of ending homelessness and the strategy to do so? Is there a timeline set to that? Given that the last government had a very clear timeline which they weren't able to achieve, how are we going to be able to ensure that this time it's different?
I think it's really challenging to set a timeline for it, and in particular the challenges we face with the inheritance that we've got at the moment, and the projections of where homelessness is going, and therefore one of the biggest things we need to do is deal with the supply. And obviously, as I say, the Section 21 no fault evictions are having a significant impact on homelessness as well. So some of the learnings from those 20 local authorities that we're looking at, those pilot projects, there is also, I'd just like to add, some incredible work that's going on an individual local authority level and mayors. I might be biased, it's Greater Manchester Mayor, but I've seen a bed for a night and what the Greater Manchester has achieved through the combined authority on tackling homelessness and how we can learn from that. But there is unique challenges for different areas, rural areas, city areas, coastal areas. So therefore, part of the piloting and looking at what works is about how some of the challenges that local areas face need to, one size doesn't fit all, but I think some of the bigger challenges, and you allude to it in terms of the Kerslake report, is around, it's not just about providing a home, it's around having the right services for people when they need it at the time that's right for them, and being able to access that. And I was reminded at Christmas of the work that Shelter was doing around, people coming in and then having those services available immediately for people at the time when they need it, so that we can get them on track. I think that's incredibly important, and there's other work that we've also been doing with the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice as well, around people who faces homelessness as well, because they provide pressures on the system as well. So making sure that, for example, we inherited a dire situation with the prison system, is how we can make sure that this service is available. So if you are leaving prison, that you're able to get employment opportunity, or that we can access services so that people don't end up homeless and end up back in a cycle of crime because we haven't got the services in place to support them. So there's a lot of work that our interministerial team have been looking at, of how we can try and make sure that those services are there for people when they need it the most, because that will affect their outcomes longer term, and therefore it will cost us more money if we don't do that at the beginning.
And obviously, I appreciate that you've set out why it's challenging to set out a timeline at this stage, but is there a targeted approach to this in terms of how you would see a year-on reduction in rough sleeping particularly, or anything that you're working towards, or is this still something that you're not able to put a figure on at this point in time?
I would be very hesitant to put a figure on it, but we really want to see an impact. And part of the problem, I suppose, is not just the fact of plugging the hole, but it's also the amount that's coming in. So there is a problem around there's a lot of work that's going on that's preventing, but then the sheer volume that's coming in, you're not really seeing a reduction at the moment. So the frustration for me is that the issue around longer term problems around supply will just keep us coming back to this point over and over again. So we're taking measures now, and I think the measures around ending Section 21 no fault evictions, the measures we're taking around prevention of homelessness, the measures that we're taking to support local authorities in terms of their ability to build the houses they need, I think they will have an impact, but we need to see a real dramatic increase in the number of supply of housing in order to really be able to reflect a net significant drop in homelessness, because the pressures are so acute that more people are coming into the system as we can get out of the system at the moment.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Just one other question, if I may, Chair, on this. Specifically, I know we've talked a lot already about temporary accommodation and the pressures that it places, and also the need to have that long-term strategy in place in order to deal with the supply issue. However, there is an immediate pressure, and there is an immediate need in certain places to tackle some of the challenges. Firstly, the conditions in temporary accommodation, which aren't necessarily always meeting the standards that we would expect. And secondly, out-of-borough placements, which you have touched upon in terms of the impacts that they have on people's life chances, particularly young people. Is there any plans, or are there any plans to tackle those two issues in terms of legislation, to look at both out-of-borough placements, the impact that it has on the individuals as well as the host authorities, but also temporary accommodation in the immediate term?
Yeah, so as I say, in November I wrote to local authorities reminding them of their duties in terms of out-of-borough placements and housing, and making sure that people get the support that they need. And I suppose within that question is a real tension and a challenge, and I see this every single day, that people at the moment, their housing needs are not adequate. There is people in housing that is not good for their health. It's not safe for them, but they are too frightened to even raise the alarm of this is not adequate for me, because no sooner have they raised it, they will either be put out of borough, their children are disrupted from their school, or they'll find somebody else, a landlord will Section 21 no fault evict them and find someone else who'll be quite happy to move in and will take the squalor that they're putting them in. And I say that not all landlords are like that. There are some incredibly decent landlords out there. So the decent home standards, the Arabs law, the new home standards that we're introducing, it's about making sure that we can support people in having safe and secure housing as well, but acknowledging at the moment that I'm under no illusion that there are significant numbers of people at the moment who, not just in temporary accommodation, but in their housing that they've got at the moment is completely not safe for them and not adequate, and we have to address those issues. And we've put additional funding aside to support support landlords as well. We've said we want to work with landlords to make sure that they can bring their homes up to standards as well. So this isn't about landlords are bad. This is about, look, you know, we need to acknowledge that we have a housing crisis in this country, and it's not just about building the homes, but it's also about making sure the homes that we've got currently, and even the temporary accommodation, is fit for human habitation, and that we don't see a situation where we had, unfortunately, in Greater Manchester, where Arab lost his life, and the contributing factor to that was the housing that he was in, and we want to turn that around.
What we've said is that, just to add to Deputy Prime Minister said about decency and kind of the importance of things like the Decent Home Standard for temporary accommodation, is that we've said that we'll consult on how we would extend the Decent Home Standard to temporary accommodation. There are some complexities in doing that, partly because of use of B&B accommodation and hotel accommodation, which is obviously something that the guidance steers local government against, but is unfortunately used quite extensively at the moment, but with a view to applying that Decent Home Standard to temporary accommodation precisely for the reasons that you point out. Obviously, local authorities already have a duty to avoid Category 1 hazards in temporary accommodation, but clearly, kind of, as Deputy Prime Minister set out, we want kind of much higher quality accommodation for people than that.
Okay. Just one very final follow-up. Is there anything going to be done to discourage out-of-borough placements, particularly where you see people being sent hundreds of miles away from their original, their family network, their friends, or their original authority?
I think we already sort of set out that we should local government should avoid out-of-borough placements except when absolutely necessary, and kind of that's what Deputy Prime Minister's letter sort of underlined and emphasised. I would have thought we'd want to say a bit more about it in the long-term homelessness strategy that we're publishing later this year.
Joe.
Just one very specific follow-up on the homelessness prevention grant. There is a new restriction within that, which is 49% needs to be spent on prevention. And of course, we all support prevention in the long term, but for London councils specifically, some of them are really concerned about that because they spend approximately 80% of the grant currently on temporary accommodation. So is there a risk that that restriction is a little bit of a one-size-fits-all model and could actually exacerbate some of the funding pressures in places like London with very high numbers of temporary accommodation?
Well, I mean, it is true that clearly more of the homelessness prevention grant has been being spent on temporary accommodation in recent times than we would want to have seen to be the case. We want it to be spent upstream rather than downstream. We have looked at the distribution of the homelessness prevention grant to try and target where there are some of those extra needs which you talk about in London, and I know from many of my conversations with chief executives and officials across London councils just how sort of serious those pressures are. It's not the only funding that's spent on temporary accommodation. Kind of some comes out of core council funds, which obviously we've put extra money into as well. But we always remain sort of open to discussing particular issues that councils are experiencing, as DPM said earlier, in terms of kind of pressures that they're experiencing or problems that they've got, and looking at how we can help with that. But clearly, until we can get funding to be a bit more upstream and less downstream on homelessness, we're simply going to see increased numbers in temporary accommodation, and children in particular, where we know that's a specifically severe problem in London.
So you cannot confirm that councils are going to have to fund that gap from their general funds?
Well, all I'm saying is that kind of at the moment, kind of the funding for temporary accommodation comes out of sort of several different sources for councils, that we absolutely recognise we've put an increase into that homelessness prevention grant and looked at ways in which we can distribute it and match with needs. But ultimately, we do need some of the funding to go more upstream than it has been in recent times.
Continue on your point, please.
So I wanted to move on to remediation. Obviously, this year will be the 8th anniversary since Grenfell Tower, and the National Audit Office recently estimated that we still have they estimate 60% of buildings have not yet even been identified, and the Remediation Action Plan obviously puts new targets on speeding that up. How exactly can we speed up this identification? Because if we don't know what the buildings are, obviously you can't even then move on to the very lengthy phase of actually remediating them.
Yeah, and I totally acknowledge that point. More than 7 years after the Grenfell tragedy, the remediation has begun or has been completed on only 48% of those buildings that we've identified, and that's why we felt it was completely unacceptable and that we needed to have a plan which is now covered by, I think, 95% of those developers, and those people that are responsible will be part of the remediation acceleration plan to make sure by the end of this Parliament that all those buildings that we've identified above 18 metres will have the remediation completed. And we're also looking at the buildings that are under just over 11 metres as well with unsafe cladding, and making sure that they're on a path to that as well. Otherwise, the landlords will be liable for severe penalties as part of that. We're also looking at how we can identify those buildings as well, and people coming forward. There's a piece of work that we're trying to do with the looking at the land audit, etc., and trying to make sure that people do come forward so that we do have a understanding of how many buildings that are currently that we think that are not in the programme at the moment that actually could be in need of this remediation. At the moment, we don't have a true figure. It could be, I think, up to 7,000. Yeah.
And once the buildings have been identified, the next thing in the remediation plan is around forcing action. And one of the big frustrations that people have is this buck passing between developers and freeholders. Obviously the issue of what leaseholders will face versus others. And the scale of this is huge. You know, I mean, it's millions of people around the country. So I'm just trying to understand, if we sped up the identification, will government consider taking a much more hands-on approach to actually forcing action? Because the plan says that this will be considered, but doesn't really then say how we'll actually knock heads together to actually get these buildings finally into a decent state.
The short answer is yes, and I'll consider bringing legislation forward. We believe that we will need further legislation from the phase 2 of the Grenfell report, and we're committed to making sure that we do everything we can to meet those targets that we need to meet to ensure that people feel safe and that remediation happens. So if we can't knock heads together, then we do need to make sure that we take action. I have met with the main developers and people involved in the housing sector. I've also met those various different organisations that are responsible for building safety as well, to look at where there are potential gaps, where it's like trying to pin blancmange to a wall, and where people are trying to get out of it, and how we can clarify that and then take action. There has already been extra support given, and local authorities have started to take serious legal action against those that are not remediating those buildings, and we've been supporting the action, and we have not taken anything off the table in terms of bringing forward more legislation if it's needed. The previous government introduced quite significant legislation regarding this after the Grenfell tragedy, and it's just for me it's shocking that we're still in a position today where thousands of buildings have still got this unsafe cladding, and people are going to bed at night every night in buildings that need that remediation, and the same people that want to build the houses now want to say, well, it's not our responsibility, and I don't accept that, and I've made that very clear to them that I expect them to do everything they can to make sure that they do that. And like I say, at least 30 developers have signed up to, that's covering 95% of the buildings, to make sure that we have that remediation completed before the end of this Parliament.
And conscious of time, sorry, just to switch topics to elections briefly, does the government recognise the risks of potential foreign funding in our political system and a general lack of transparency and accountability around money in politics, and when might we expect some action on this?
Well, yes, we were looking at this in opposition around how we can make sure that elections are transparent and that funding and donations are transparent within our system, and we continue to look at that and making sure that we have the systems in place that people have confidence in. The one thing I would say is that I think in all of the reports we've had in the past, that in terms of electoral fraud is very, 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 very minor, and therefore we want to enfranchise people into exercising their vote, and we've looked at voter ID as part of that and supporting that process, but equally we want to see transparency in the process of where donations come from, and people are very clear about that and that the rules are followed.
Do you know when we might see legislation or a bill on this? Or?
Well, it wasn't within the King's Speech this time, because I think you'll have noticed that quite a lot of the King's Speech legislation was in my department this time, and just to say a huge thank you to all of the civil servants and the ministers and everybody else that's been working with us on what the task we took on since the election. But I certainly would want to do that as soon as possible, certainly before the next general election, so people are very clear and have confidence in our electoral system and in the transparency, and that people can exercise their right to vote. I get frustrated that people feel disconnected from politics and politicians. I want people to be engaged with that process and to have confidence in our political system, and that's what we'll be hoping to achieve.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring in Gagan just back on planning.
Thank you, Chairman. Just Secretary of State, thank you for attending this afternoon. I've had a correspondence from George, one of my constituents, who's disabled, and they wanted to talk about future-proofing your planning. They're wheelchair users. The question they've asked me to pose to you is, how many of the new homes that Labour plan to build will be wheelchair accessible? In London, 10% of all new builds must meet the M4 (3) wheelchair standard. Will the Secretary of State roll this 10% quota to the rest of England so more wheelchair homes are built? Second question, given the huge shortage of accessible housing, will the Secretary of State be implementing Section 36 of the Equality Act and Schedule 4 and bring them into force? If so, when? I understand that they're very technical questions. I'm happy for you to write back to me, but I did want to acknowledge George did write to me. So.
Sure, and thank you to George for writing, and I think there has been announcements that's been made in the Department for Health as well around accessibility recent in the last couple of days to make sure that people can retrofit and to get the equipment that they need to live independent lives. But what we don't want to do, and I think, you know, without answering the specifics, which I can get back to you on, is we want houses to be accessible. First point, we don't want to be having to retrofit, or we don't want. We've got the same problem with energy efficiency, and that's why we're saying that homes should be safe, secure, and energy efficient, but they also should be accessible. So there is a lot of things that we could do, which actually if we're doing them up front as we're looking at the planning stage, that actually will impact. And you touched on accessible housing in terms of, I think I mentioned earlier as well, around people who maybe want to downsize, but there isn't the ability for them to do that at the moment. I think there's a high demand on bungalows. I think if we could build more bungalows, people would be very, very happy. But I do think sheltered accommodation and supported living as well, there's not been the resources put into that as well. So we're looking at how we can support through housing associations, through local authorities and with developers about building mixed tenures. And it comes back to my point I think I made to Lewis before, or it might have been Lee, about how houses are built for not about what the profit could be, but actually about what is the need in their area and having much more focus on that. So stretching the 106, making sure we comply with that, but making sure that local authorities and local housing providers have the resources they need to match the demand that we have in the areas, and that if we're building homes we should be trying where possible to future proof them so that we're not creating these problems that we find in older buildings that are difficult to retrofit.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of time. If we could keep the replies a bit more succinct. Just on that, Secretary of State, you'll be aware that the predecessor committee had a report, an inquiry on disabled people in the housing sector. We still haven't received a reply to that, so it'd be helpful if we could get, as a committee, get a response to that.
I will chase that, Chair.
Thank you.
Moving on to devolution, which we had a number of questions on, but we'll focus on some of the things that maybe aren't talked about as much. So firstly, a lot of the devolution deals that have happened so far have been in metropolitan areas, but obviously the opportunities going forward are a lot more sort of shire areas and county areas. So can you just tell me a bit about what you see as the greatest challenges and the greatest opportunities for devolution in those more rural and sort of disparate areas?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that the main thing for me is I want to see not a patchwork of devolution. I want to see the whole of England to have devolution deals. I've been really upfront about that, and I want to see collaboration, and I've said that. I said it at the Local Government Association at their conference, and I've said it to local authorities. I don't want to pitch them against each other. I want them to collaborate. And this is the issue that we've also said around unitarisation and looking at how we can get the best and most efficient, but also the landscape and the economy of scale to devolve more powers to areas. So it's not a local authority footprint. So transport, connectivity, skills, employment, these are big, chunky central government powers at the moment that actually, if we could get more devolution and more combined authorities and a mayoral model where there's a seat around the table of the Council of England where they'll be there, then actually I think we can make an incredible difference to ordinary people's lives, because people don't go on about their council much. They don't. Their footprint of their life isn't around. Oh, I just stay. Like take mine for. I just stay in Tameside. You know, we move, we work into Manchester or into Oldham, and the bus and the family connections and the jobs connections are much more bigger footprint than that. So for me, having devolution across the board is what I want, and what I've tried to do is match that ambition by the paper we're bringing forward on devolution is about how we can give more powers, and we can show that actually by having that strategic approach, looking at how you can combine and collaborate together, you can deliver better outcomes in your local areas. So it's not about taking powers up, it's about bringing powers down, but having the economy of scale to really deliver those outcomes for people locally.
And do you see any sort of more specific different challenges for those more shire areas than we've seen maybe so far in some of the more metropolitan devolution deals?
I think so, but I also see some really good opportunities. So, for example, local healthcare, matching people's healthcare needs, the healthcare in some of the rural areas that are schools and skills and education and transport and connectivity is a different challenge to what you'd get in an urban area, for example. So I think them having more control in that combined area will allow them to cater for those needs. I do see that areas, I want to be very careful here. I know people are very close to their identity as an area, and therefore that can be a challenge to ask them to collaborate with partners next door. But actually on some things, I think it's a case of, well, you could get more by doing it locally with your partners there, by a Secretary of State in Whitehall who might not know your rural area that well, saying this is what we think you should have. So I think actually it could be an opportunity to deliver better outcomes in rural areas.
Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I want to talk about the impacts of reorganisation and devolution, if I may. So I'll try to fire through two and then come to the third in a bit. I've always thought your priority was housing, delivering housing targets, something that I agree on. But doesn't reorganising councils distract them from delivering that housing target, particularly them agreeing their local plan? Local authorities can either deliver that 1.5 million or they can reorganise. Do you think they can do both? Isn't it counterproductive to risk trying to make them do both? And secondly, on social care is the elephant in the room on local government finances. With the government review into social care and funding concluding in 2028, councils generally underfunded now, and a decent chunk of them are going to be restructured in that time. How do you think councils are able to cope with those three challenges at once?
Well, I think what it can do is it's an opportunity to do that. I think actually part of the challenge back is that by working rather than pitching against, but actually collaborating, working together, you can meet that. So I alluded to it in terms of, two different boroughs could have local plans that integrate with each other that can deliver their joint housing targets. So if you've got 10% of the land in one local authority, 30% in another and 40% over this way, then you could end up in a situation where you haven't got that in your local plan, or it isn't delivering. Whereas if you can combine together with your local housing mandatory targets, you could actually deliver a bigger infrastructure programme that delivers the housing and the infrastructure, so you can combine your efforts and deal with those problems. And so I think that the reorganisation is quite critical to get the mass in order to deliver some of these really big challenges that we face as well. So the challenge back is, I would say that it could be an opportunity. Yes, there is always threats with opportunities, but I actually think it's the way forward for them to gain more powers from the centre, for them to be able to deliver at scale on some of these issues, which is around housing, you're right, but also around social care as well, because social care and primary care services and the interface between primary care and the NHS, I think being able to look at it in a bigger area actually will be able to deal with some of these big ingrained challenges that you may face that you couldn't do at a small sort of unitary level.
And finally, I suppose I speak as the MP for Zara Sharif. I'm really concerned that reorganising councils when they're trying to protect vulnerable children or vulnerable adults, it's a risk of distraction. The Prime Minister told the House just before Christmas he plans to review children's social care. How's that review going to be implemented at the same time they're reorganising? What impact assessment has the government made on the risk to vulnerable people whilst you're reorganising?
Yeah, and what happened there was an absolute awful case. And I think one of the challenges is that councils are very clear around their safeguarding and their children's services and what their statutory obligations are, and they should be ingrained, and the recording mechanisms and also the way in which they're inspected is the same. So there should be no deviation or excuse to not safeguard young people and children, because they are statutory obligations that each and every local authority has, and therefore they should be able to carry out those duties. And I don't see how reorganisation is an excuse not to do that. I think it's very important that we learn the lessons of the past as well, and making sure that actually that all of those systems are not failing. Far too many cases I've seen, even in my time in local government as an MP, constantly seeing where young people have fell through the net, and we've got to make sure that we deal with that, and we make sure that our children's services are absolutely up to scratch, and that we know where our young people are, we're identifying them, and that we're able to support them when they need it the most.
We'll bring in Lewis and then Sarah.
Thank you. So in the Devolution white paper, it talks about unitarisation, it talks about 500,000 people. What does that mean in reality? Does that mean creating super councils of 1 million plus? Does that mean creating councils of 200,000? Can you just tell us your thoughts around how fixed that 500,000 is?
Well, we've set a benchmark that we would consider it to be around 500,000. We've not said it has to definitely be 500,000, and if it's so, therefore there's a number of factors. What we're saying is local areas, to give them a ballpark, is we want you to come together. We want to find that efficiency. We think that 500,000 is a benchmark figure, but it could be slightly less depending on the local circumstances, or it could be more, but that we want to see the economies of scale so that they can collaborate and come together.
What does slightly less mean? Does that mean 300,000, 350,000?
Well, not really, no. We've said 250,000, we've said 500,000, but if a local area came to us and said, right, well, we've got these district councils here, and we want to come together, and we think that this is the right area for us, and this is why we think it, because we can deliver on education, we can deliver on social care outcomes, etc., etc. These are the benefits of it, and this is the geography of why we've come together to collaborate. We're not going to say, well, actually, no, we think you lot know nothing. We're working with local areas to say, find that economy of scale and work. I mean, there has been acknowledgement that the economies of scale isn't always there, and therefore working with them to find that local solution is how I'm trying to work towards it. We've put the benchmark of 500,000 to give them an idea of what we would think of it. So if two came together and said we're 200,000, we'd probably be thinking you're not there really, you haven't got it, but we're working with them locally.
So what are you going to do? So you're reorganising the Conservative counties. What are you doing about the small London councils, or your own councils, 231,000 according to the last census? So are you saying to them, well, you've got to merge with the council next door because you're not quite big enough? Or say Lambeth, 317,000, are you saying to them, you've got to merge with the London Borough next door because you're not big enough? What are you doing in those cases?
Yeah, well, we're part of Greater Manchester Combined Authority, so we already collaborate. So we collaborate on social care, we collaborate because we've got devolved. Andy Burnham, as our mayor, has got a significant number of devolved powers. We collaborate on our housing plans, for example. So we collaborate on our transport services. We've seen some significant benefits actually from our local authority from that collaboration, and I would encourage local authorities to collaborate more. I would encourage my local authority to collaborate more, because I think people's lives don't work on the boundary of, well, you're Tameside, so it doesn't matter what's going on in Oldham, or it doesn't matter what's going on next door in Stockport, because actually people's lives don't work like that. So actually finding ways to how our healthcare system operates. My mum lives in Stockport, I live in Tameside. She's visited Stepping Hill Hospital, she's visited Tameside Hospital. I mean, the needs are the same. How you can collaborate services to deliver for people in local areas, and also transport routes, I would say is incredibly important. So I wouldn't exclude my local authority from doing that as well. I think it's a really important way of safeguarding and delivering the better services for people. People's lives don't work off local authority boundaries or district council boundaries, but what we're trying to do with reorganisation is deliver the size and scale to deliver quality public services for people at a local level that recognises that people's lives don't work off the demarcation of what we do in local government.
So you will ask small Labour metropolitan councils to consider merging as well then?
Well, we're asking people to collaborate, and we're looking at how we can deliver the economies of scale so that people can deliver better outcomes for people, and we've been very clear about that. And collaboration is what I've said is a driving force of this government, not competition, not pitching one against each other. I know you use Labour and Conservative. I'm not in the business of doing that. What I'm trying to do is look at how we can deliver better outcomes. And in fact, as a Labour government, I'm trying to devolve more to local areas, and you'll know those local areas are not always Labour areas. I'm trying to work to deliver better outcomes for the electorate that have lost faith a lot of the time in politics being a driver for change in their areas, whereas what I would argue is devolution has unlocked change. Like, we've got better transport and bus systems in Greater Manchester because we've had devolution, so I'd say it's a win for people in their local area.
On that, very briefly, currently councils are obviously considering, including in Lancashire, county councils are considering the option of delaying elections in order to allow for devolution and local government reorganisation to move forward at pace. However, it's led to some suggestions of our country being like a dictatorship, so I was curious as to how you would respond to those accusations.
Well, we're not dictating, first of all, and the Minister for Local Government and Devolution wrote to councils in two-tier areas and their neighbouring small unitaries on the 16th of December to set out the next steps for delivering devolution and reorganisation. And the letter indicated that we would be willing to postpone elections if the council requests that to help them manage the demands of planning for devolution alongside reorganisation. And it is an if, and it's not us dictating that. And it really is about, if they are looking at reorganisation, they are coming together, it would be absolutely ludicrous to do that in the middle and then have another election within like a few months of them just about to have an election because they're reorganising how they do things. It would be a crazy situation. But we're not dictating to local authorities to say you've got to stop elections. Our devolution agenda is not to delay or stop elections. I want to see more democracy exercised, and that's what devolution is about for me, is about giving more power to people to see how politics can genuinely change their lives for the better.
Last final question.
Yes, so thank you very much for answering so many of our questions. But my last question is just around our town centres and high streets, which are such an important part of so many of our local communities. And as you've just talked about, giving that power locally, just in terms of what are the safeguards that are going to be put in place to enable businesses and within our high streets and those who want to set up local enterprises, and how can we ensure that our high streets and town centres are thriving given the budget that we've had recently and the forward plan for this government?
Thank you. Yeah, we continue to work with high street businesses, and the Chancellor and the Business Secretary has been really clear on making sure across government sort of effort is to support those high street. We're addressing strategic issues on areas including high street regeneration. You'll have seen the things we've done with the high street rental auctions, which gives more power to local authorities to bring high streets back into life. The skills issue, sustainability and productivity. And we're supporting small businesses' ability to invest and grow with a range of measures, including protecting small businesses from the inflation in business rates by freezing the small business multiplier for this coming year. And we're also looking at improving the financing offer for businesses looking to export and committing to continued funding for key business support programmes like the Growth Hubs and Help to Grow. So we recognise the challenges that small businesses have faced. I know it was a difficulty in terms of the relief that they were getting through the COVID period, and the Chancellor recognised that in the budget by making sure that we gave some protection and long-term sustainable, so they understood what was coming and how that was, because it was a cliff edge before, whereas now we've been looking at how we can support small businesses on the high street. So there's a number of measures we're taking, and we've also done a lot of work on antisocial behaviour as well, and making sure that there is powers and measures and police in place so that we can support the high streets, where often people are frightened of a crime that they see going on. And there is a number of things we're also doing to support shop workers as well, that we've been putting forward in terms of legislation to protect them from violence and for shoplifting.
Final follow-up. Thank you for that. Just one final follow-up on the rental auctions. Obviously, I appreciate that's a current phased pilot that's being reviewed. At the minute, it doesn't necessarily give that flexibility around buildings that have been sat empty for a longer period of time as opposed to shorter. Will there be opportunities for local authorities to feed back whether it's working in terms of some of the challenges they're facing? Because, you know, if you've had a property empty for 1 year, then I think at the minute that offers a real solution. But if you've had properties empty for 15 years that could be really brought back into use, it's not quite there yet.
I think the sort of purpose of doing it in that kind of rolling pilot kind of form is precisely because we want to get that kind of feedback, and obviously we're bringing forward further work on supporting communities later this year, and high streets will be a vital part of that because we understand how important it is to the success of towns and cities that people live in.
So the English Devolution Bill also has the right to buy for valued community assets, and again that I think feeds into to that process as well.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State, and thank you, Permanent Sec, for attending the Select Committee this morning, answering our questions. We look forward to welcoming you at future Select Committee meetings. I'll bring the meeting to a close. Order, order.